presidential pardons. Let's talk about them. The presidential pardon power is a power granted to the President of the United States under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. This states that the President shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Let's dive into some key aspects of presidential pardons. Who can be pardoned by a presidential pardon? The president can pardon individuals or groups who have committed federal crimes. This does not apply to state crimes. This is only federal crimes. Only a state's governor can issue a state-level pardon. A pardon can be granted before or after conviction and even before formal charges are filed. What are the effects of a pardon? A pardon forgives the crimes, but it does not necessarily mean the individual is innocent. It will remove the punishments such as imprisonment or fines, but it does not erase the conviction off the person's record. What are the limitations on pardons? A pardon cannot be used to pardon an impeachment, like a president cannot pardon themselves or another from impeachment consequences. A president cannot pardon someone from a civil case. This only applies to criminal cases. A presidential pardon also does not restore public office if that person was disqualified based off their crimes. What is the process of a pardon? The Office of the Pardon Attorney in the Department of Justice will review the applications for pardons. The president has the final say and is not required to follow the DOJ's recommendations. Many pardons are issued at a president's end of term for political reasons. What are some famous presidential pardons? I'm going to start with George Washington, and I'm going to work up to the pardons that have happened in, say, the past 2 months or so, and we're going to talk about them. In 1795, George Washington would pardon the leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion, which was a tax protest in Pennsylvania. This was an early test of federal authority, and Washington's pardon was seen as an attempt to unify the young nation. In 1868, Andrew Johnson would pardon thousands of former Confederates. This included Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States. This was part of his lenient reconciliation policies, and it angered radical Republicans in Congress. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant is going to further reconciliation by pardoning most of the remaining Confederate officials who had not been pardoned by Johnson. In 1921, Warren G. Harding is going to pardon Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a socialist and labor activist who was imprisoned for opposing World War I and violating the Espionage Act. Harding felt like his pardon was a move towards healing the nation after war. In 1974, Gerald Ford is going to pardon Richard Nixon. This is perhaps one of the most famous presidential pardons in history. Ford pardoned Nixon for any crimes related to the Watergate scandal. This controversial decision aimed to move the country forward, but it would damage Ford's political standing. In 1977, on his first day of office, Jimmy Carter would pardon hundreds of thousands of men who evaded the draft during the Vietnam War. In 1989, Ronald Reagan would pardon George Steinbrenner. George was the owner of the New York Yankees and was convicted for illegal campaign contributions, but Reagan pardoned him, restoring all of his rights. In 2001, Bill Clinton would pardon Mark Rich. On his last day in office, Clinton would pardon Mark Rich, a wealthy financier who was accused of tax evasion and fraud. This was controversial because of the rich's financial ties to Democratic donors and the Democratic Party. In 2007, George W. Bush would pardon Louis Scooter Libby. Libby was an advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney and was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice in the Valerie Plum CIA leak case. Bush commuted his sentence, but did not grant him a full pardon. Trump would later give him the full pardon in 2018. Now we're going to talk about the pardons of the last two presidents. I'm going to mention Donald Trump's first term, Joe Biden's term, and what Donald Trump has done at the beginning of his second term. During Donald Trump's first term in 2020 and 2021, he would issue numerous pardons. Some of those pardoned were Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, who were convicted in a Russian investigation, Steve Bannon, who was charged with fraud in a fundraising scheme, Michael Flynn, who was a former national security advisor who was convicted of lying to the FBI, and rappers Lil Wayne and Kodak Black, who were convicted on weapons charges. During Joe Biden's term as president, he had multiple pardons. In 2022, Biden would pardon all individuals convicted of simple marijuana possessions under federal law. In 2023, he would expand those to individuals convicted of marijuana possessions on federal grounds, regardless of whether they had been charged or prosecuted. December 1st of 2024, President Biden would issue a full and unconditioned pardon to his son, Hunter Biden. This covered all federal offenses that could have been committed from January 1st, 2014 to December 1st, 2024. This unprecedented move, he said, was to protect his son from what he described as selective and unfair prosecution. A little bit later in December, Biden would have the largest single-day act of clemency in United States history. Biden would commute the sentences of approximately 1,500 nonviolent offenders who had been released to home confinement during the COVID-19 pandemic. This action also included 39 pardons of individuals convicted of nonviolent crimes, particularly drug offenses. Towards the end of December, Biden would commute the sentences of 37 out of 40 death row inmates, reducing their sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This decision was part of his administration's broader efforts to address concerns about the death penalty. And on January 20th, 2025, in his last hours in office, Biden would grant preemptive pardons to several individuals, including family members, which were his brother James Biden and his wife Sarah, his sister Valerie and her husband John Owens, and his brother Francis. He would also grant pardons to Dr. Fauci, the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, retired General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the members of the House Select Committee who investigated the January 6th Capitol attack. He says these pardons were a preemptive measure to protect individuals from potential political prosecution by the incoming administration. But these pardons are very, very controversial. And moving on to Donald Trump's first few days in office, this is who he pardoned. Trump would issue pardons to approximately 1,500 individuals charged or convicted in connection with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. He would also pardon Ross Ulbricht, which I hope I'm saying his name right. Ross's pardon would be a full and unconditional pardon. Ross had been the founder of a dark web marketplace called Silk Road. He was serving 2 life sentences plus 40 years for charges including conspiracy to commit drug trafficking and money laundering. And in his first few days in office, Trump pardoned 23 anti-abortion protesters who were convicted of offenses related to blockading clinics. Some people support President Trump's pardons in these first few days, while others express concerns about the potential implications for the rule of law and the encouragement of political violence. With the pardons that Biden gave his last couple months in office and the pardons that Trump has given his first couple days in office, there's been a lot of talk about how much pardoning power should the president have? Should we limit that power? Should there be more like checks that go through before somebody is pardoned? So let's talk about some of the arguments for limiting the presidential pardon power, and let's talk about some arguments against limiting the presidential pardon power. One argument for limiting the presidential pardon power is to prevent against political corruption. Presidents have used the pardon power to protect allies, such as Ford pardoned Nixon, Trump pardoned Roger Stone, Biden pardoned the January 6th committee. Another argument against limiting presidential pardon power is avoiding abuse of power. The presidential power to pardon someone is virtually unchecked. A president can issue self-serving or preemptive pardons and no one can stop them. An example of this could be Bill Clinton pardoning Mark Rich, who was a wealthy person who was criticized because Rich had donated to Democratic organizations and Democratic fundraising. Another argument for limiting presidential pardons is it ensures accountability. Pardons have been used to shield officials from investigations, such as George H.W. Bush's Iran-Contra pardons or Joe Biden's January 6th committee pardons. The reason I'm mentioning Biden's pardons is because they just happened, and that's what people are thinking about. Limiting the power would ensure equal justice under the law. Another argument for limiting presidential pardon power is it prevents the encouragement of criminal activity. If allies to the president believe that they're going to be automatically pardoned if they do something wrong, they may engage in illegal activity because they feel like, oh, well, if I do this, they're going to pardon me anyway. Some have argued that Trump's January 6th related pardons could incentivize future insurrections. And the last argument for limiting presidential pardon power is improving transparency. A lot of the pardons that are given in the last couple days or even the last hours of someone's presidency to avoid public scrutiny. If there were limitations or maybe like a review process, this could ensure fairness on the pardons. Now, what are the arguments against limiting presidential pardon power? It is a necessary check on the justice system. Mistakes happen in the justice system, and pardons allow the presidents to correct injustices, such as Barack Obama's clemency for nonviolent drug offenders. You had Joe Biden, who had the largest day clemency act with 1,500 nonviolent offenders. And you have Thomas Jefferson, who pardoned those under the Alien and Sedition Act, which criminalized dissent. Another argument against limiting the presidential pardon power is the separation of powers. The founders intended for the president to have unchecked pardon power as a check on judicial review. Courts don't always act fairly, and a bureaucratic process could undermine the intent of the pardon power. Another argument against limiting the presidential pardon power is national reconciliation. Pardons can heal divisions, such as Jimmy Carter's amnesty for the Vietnam War draft dodgers, and when Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson pardoned those in charge of the South after the Civil War. And the last argument against limiting presidential pardon power is the flexibility of emergencies. Sometimes a quick pardon is necessary for political stabilization or to de-escalate a crisis. An example of this could be Ford's pardon of Nixon, which was controversial, but arguably helped the country move forward. There are some talks about a potential reform instead of full limitations. And so I'm going to go over a couple of the potential reforms that are being talked about, have been talked about in the past, and let's see what you think of them. One reform could be that the president would be required to give public justification. This would mean the president would have to give a written explanation for every pardon he gives, especially those that are controversial. Another reform that's been talked about is banning self-pardons, meaning a president cannot pardon themselves. There's been talk of maybe creating a congressional oversight committee to look at the pardons. This would give Congress a limited review over certain pardons. Another potential reform that has been talked about is limiting or ending last-minute pardons. People who have talked about this reform or this limitation want to limit pardons that they cannot be done in the last 30 days of a presidency. And another potential reform people have talked about is excluding certain crimes. The people who have talked about excluding certain crimes, what they are pushing forward is no pardons for crimes related to a president's own administration, such as obstruction of justice. Should the presidential pardon power be limited? There's a lot that goes into that question, and it depends on whether you prioritize executive power or you want to prevent possible abuse. But what if you want to prioritize executive power and prevent possible abuse? Where is the middle ground? There may be a balance in reforming the presidential pardon power without entirely restricting it. What is your opinion? What do you think? Do you support reforms, or do you believe a president should retain unlimited pardon power as originally intended in the Constitution? Let me know in the comments below.